Hi, this is Estelle Erasmus, your host for Freelance Writing Direct. In this short soundbite-filled podcast, I'll cover everything the freelance and creative writer and author needs to do to move forward with their writing, their creativity, and their career. Through conversations with guests, we'll cover tips, tricks, and actionable strategies. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes and Spotify. Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, and today I'm so excited to have as my guest Bianca Marais. She is the author of the best-selling book, The Witches of Moonshine Manor, as well as The Beloved Hum, if you don't know the words and if you want to make God laugh, as well as the Audible original, The Prin Viper. She taught at the University of Toronto School of Continuing Studies, where she was awarded an Excellence in Teaching Award for Creative Writing in 2021. She's the co-host of the popular podcast, The Shit No One Tells You About Writing, which is aimed at helping emerging writers become published. She now teaches creative writing through the podcast and in her personal capacity. She lives in Toronto with her husband and golden retriever, and she's furiously working away on finishing her next novel. It's so great to have you here, Bianca. I'm so excited to be on a panel with you at PodFest in 2024. So this is going to be so much fun.
It's going to be really fun. I actually can't wait for that, to meet you in person, but how wonderful to be on the podcast. Thank you.
We're going to have so much fun. So I read your book, and in my book, I talk about that when I was a kid, I read like 400 books about fantasy. I was obsessed with fantasy books, and I particularly love books about witches. And I just devoured your book, The Witches of Moonshine Manor. It's my favorite subject. And you've written other books with a very different focus, but this one is fantasy focused. And so what made you decide to go in that direction?
Yeah. So the first two books were more serious, based on apartheid in South Africa. And this book was going to be another serious book because it came to me about two women who were in their 80s. They had a very dysfunctional friendship. One of them was losing her memory. And I wanted to explore what friendship means, what sisterhood means. And is it possible to remember somebody when they have forgotten themselves? And I talk about when you begin a book, you circle the building, trying to figure out the best way into the story. And I kept circling the building of this book. And I was going, oh gosh, I don't want to write a serious book. It was in the middle of COVID. The world had just shut down. I needed some levity and escapism. And I couldn't figure out how to write this book in a way that was going to be the diversion that I wanted it to be. And then one day I found a picture of a haunted manor. It looked like this creepy old manor. And it came to me that these two women were actually part of an ensemble cast, that they were a group of witches who had lived together their whole lives. The dysfunction was there, but it was a fantasy novel. And so that was a huge diversion for me. But also, Estelle, you'll know that in publishing, you're only as good as your last book's success, right? So you only get to publish a next book if the last one was really successful. And that didn't happen with my sophomore novel. You know, that book barely sold any copies because I got handed from one editor to the next as my editor left the publishing house, and the book just kind of got lost in all of that. And so I also had to reinvent myself as a writer and say, okay, my last book wasn't successful. What can I do now that is hopefully going to be successful? And this book ended up being a bestseller. So I got out of my comfort zone and it worked.
I love that you used a bunch of POVs. I think 5, maybe more POVs, because it's 5 octogenarian witches. And it's fascinating, in a world of ageism, that you chose to make them older and still so interesting with personality because they've lived such a long life. And that you chose to do all those POVs. So how did you do that and structure it in a way that kept the flow going throughout the book?
Yeah, so the most POVs I'd ever done before that was 3. And prior to this book, I really enjoyed first person POV compared to third. This book, I knew, okay, I would have to do a third person sort of close POV. And I knew that if there's like actually turns out to be 6 women in the sisterhood, plus there's a 15-year-old TikToker, plus there were other POVs from other characters, and the manor itself sort of becomes a character in the book as well. It sort of grumbles and it has opinions and creaks and groans, etc. So I knew it was going to be a huge challenge. Now, with most novels, we say begin at the really interesting point. Begin with the inciting incident and immediately have action, but get the reader invested in your character so that as the action moves forward, the reader is rooting for the character and they understand the stakes. That is so difficult to do with a novel with this many POVs, because you can't just have an inciting incident and you're off to the races, because if the reader doesn't know your characters while all the action is happening, they aren't going to be rooting for them. So it was really difficult to set up those opening chapters where there was an inciting incident, which is where one of the witches, Ursula, is doing her tarot reading that morning and she sees a crane and wrecking ball coming for them. But I couldn't just start with that because the reader wouldn't know who these characters were, why their home mattered to them, and why each of them was different. So I kind of did a 360-degree view. We start with Ruby as, she sees these bad omens, and then we go to each of the different witches in the house with what they are doing at the moment that the alarm sounds. So Ursula sounds the alarm and each of these women hears the alarm. And I had to do that in a way that you could differentiate each of the witches, understand why they were waiting for Ruby's return, and how each of them experienced the alarm differently. For some readers, it really worked. They loved it. Others said the beginning was a bit slow, but I can't figure out how to begin an ensemble cast novel really quickly off to the races without you first getting to care about the characters.
I love that right away you get into their witchiness because it's a tarot reading, and the tower, and I read tarot cards myself, and so reading that was so enjoyable to me because I'm like, oh yeah, I know what that means. I know what that means. And I feel that a lot of people have a misnomer about fantasy writing or fiction writing. They think that with nonfiction, it's a lot of research, which it is. But with fantasy and with fiction, there's still an element, I believe, where you have to do some research. And so you included a lot of witchy stuff in here. You shared the different rituals and the potions and the tarot card reading and the spells. And that just paints a picture for the reader of it just builds the character and it builds the craft and how they're conveying all their magic, like the way that Jezebel does something with a man in her bed. I don't want to give it all away, but it's just so cool. So what kind of research did you do for this fantasy novel?
Yeah, so the research for this book was actually less than my other books because my other books were based at periods in South African history. So the Soweto uprising in 1976. And then the next book was when Nelson Mandela became president in 1994. Even though I lived in South Africa at those times, I had to do a ton of research to get the historical context right. With this book, like you, I have always read about witches. I have always been fascinated by them because they were the first feminists They were the first woman to say, I refuse to be dictated to by the church. I refuse to be dictated to by a marriage. I will not let a husband tell me what to do. I'm going to live the way I want to live. And that's what made them so incredibly dangerous. And that's why men kept coming for them, not because they had actual magical powers, but because they refused to be dictated to. And that's what made them dangerous. So I have done so much research my whole life in terms of witches and witchcraft and the Salem witch trials, etc. But the thing with those books and with that research is they were very dependent on how magic is passed down through the maternal line, how the grandmother passes it to her daughter, passes it to her daughter, and this is how witches learn magic through that maternal line. And my witches are all orphans. And I was going, well, what happens if they don't have a mother who's going to teach them magic? Does that mean they can't be magical? So I actually wanted to break with the long tradition of the theory that applies to witches and how a witch gains her powers. And I also wanted to take a much more scientific approach. So two of my witches, Ivy and Queenie, are very cerebral, very scientific people. Queenie is an engineer. She invents things, whereas Ivy is a botanist. And so they approach magic in a very, very scientific way. They don't just go, oh, I'm going to put a spell on this tree so that this tree will flourish. They go, how does photosynthesis work? How does a tree move sugars through the tree to get it to the leaves? And when the leaves fall, what happens to those sugars? So the research I had to do was not so much on witches and witchcraft and how magic works, but on how science works and how a witch might leverage science for her magic. But I've also learned the hard way, Estelle, that you can become so fixated on research that as a writer, you use it as a technique to never actually sit down and write. You use it as a procrastination tool. And the more you know, the more you realize you know nothing and the more research you do. So I decided with this book, I would write until I got to a scene where I needed to do research. Then I would stop, I would research, find out what I needed to know, incorporate it, and move forward. I also got a few grimoires, which is a witch's book. It's a collection of all of her knowledge, all of her spells, all of her power. I looked at modern day grimoires, and then I kind of threw that out the window and said, I'm going to have fun with my own kind of thing as well. So, I think when we write fiction, it's important to know what we need to know, but also to be able to throw it out the window and say, I'm going to create my own world. I'm going to come at it from a whole new angle.
It's using your creativity to synthesize and then build on what you know and what you've learned. So who are some of your influences in fantasy writing?
Oh gosh, there's so many. I love Alice Hoffman. I loved the whole Practical Magic series. Years ago, I was a huge, huge fan of the Harry Potter series as well. J.K. Rowling has become a bit problematic now, so that's kind of ruined some of Harry Potter for me. But there are so many, pretty much anyone writing a book about witches is, the whole Discovery of Witches series. I absolutely adored that as well. Yeah, there's people doing amazing work in the whole genre.
So it's so interesting because obviously this is a book about octogenarian witches and all very different. And in this book, they're not living forever. There's no expectation that they're going to live forever. However, they have a young protege. I don't want to give the whole book away, but it lends itself to the feeling. I said, well, I would love to see a sequel with the protege and some of that other continued magic happening. Is that in the works or a possibility?
It's definitely a possibility. Again, with publishing, it all depends on, can they sell it? This is the depressing thing. We as writers use our creativity. We pour our hearts and souls into a book, into a story, and then we hand it to a publisher and it becomes this object, this commodity to be sold. So, I would love to write Persephone's story as a sequel. I have ideas for prequels as well. But I think in order for that to happen, this book would need to be optioned as a film or as a series. We have had interest in it. We do have a film agent tied to it. And the wonderful thing is we're starting to see more and more movies that are showing women who are older and who are not playing these traditional roles of the grandmother or, you know, one of these kinds of things. So I'm really hopeful that at some point this book will get optioned, that it might become a film, because I think Cher, for example, would make an excellent Jezebel. I think that Whoopi Goldberg would make a wonderful Queenie. And these are meaty characters who are doing things in their 80s, which has got nothing to do with raising children. It's got nothing to being with a mother or a grandmother or being someone's wife. They've all gotten to choose their own lives. They've all got their own powers. And I think if the book ever does become a film, it will open up the possibility for sequels. You know, if you look at Alice Hoffman, she wrote Practical Magic, and then she went on to write a whole bunch of different stories. And then she got to come back to Practical Magic because the film opened up such a big audience for it.
Yeah, and Deborah Harkness wrote A Discovery of Witches decades ago, and it is so popular and became a Netflix series, and you know, first it started in a smaller network. I was just thinking, you know, all those octogenarian actresses who have these movies like Jane Fonda and Mary Steenburgen and Candice Bergen, they kind of do these movies together. I could totally see them filling out some of the witch roles.
Absolutely. I think Jane Fonda would also make an incredible Jezebel, quite honestly. I feel like one of the reasons why I wrote this book is I'm so frustrated. So I'm 47 now, and I'm just so frustrated by the fact that so much of the advertising and everything that's coming at me is telling me not to age. How dare I age? I need to buy serums so that I don't have wrinkles. I need to dye my hair. I need to do everything to make it look like I'm not getting older. And that frustrates me because I am so happy to be getting older, because, you know, look at the alternative. And I want to celebrate that. I want to celebrate and say that we get to choose how we age. And aging is a gift. It's an honor. It's a privilege. And there's not just one way to do it. And the great thing about getting older is knowing your mind and saying, I am sick of societal pressures. I'm sick of being told how to be a woman in this world. And it's being able to, like Jane Fonda has said, like Jamie Lee Curtis has said, you know, we are not going to age just in the specific way that you're telling us how to age. And we are going to look and act the way we want to. And yeah, so this book was kind of a rally cry against, you know, these messages that come at us. I'm so sick of being told how to be a woman in this world. And now I'm being told how to be an older woman in this world. And I'm not having it.
Well, you know, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I teach for NYU writing about midlife and beyond. And I tell my students, look, the older you are, the more life experience you have, the more stories you have, the more you can write. So it gives you additional opportunities. So don't look at it as a negative. A lot of times, as we know, Bianca, it's like your mindset. And if you can have the right mindset, which you are, it's like celebrating that part. So I want to segue into your podcast, because we're talking about craft, we're talking about writing. And I love the shit no one tells you about writing, because it covers everything about book publishing, from character developments to plot and moving it forward and creating suspense and writing dialogue. And you have queries and critiques that you do, and also agents that you co-host with Carly Waters and Cecilia Lyra. So how did you get the idea for the podcast? And why did you decide to partner with the other people involved? And what is your mission for the podcast?
Yeah, so you know what? I was teaching creative writing through the University of Toronto in the February before the world shut down for COVID. One day I was in class teaching students. The next we had to pivot to online teaching. And while I was teaching online, at the same time, I was getting constant DMs from people who've read my books who were looking for writing advice. They were reaching out via Facebook, via Instagram, and I felt myself giving the same advice over and over again, which was frustrating. And as I was teaching, online, I was also thinking about people where there are barriers to entry, where they cannot afford to take this course with a university or whatever the case may be. And I thought, how can I reach more people without these barriers to entry? And I thought, well, maybe I should start a podcast. I didn't know what the heck I was doing. I got super excited when I got to 100 downloads. I was like, this is great. There's 100 people listening to me. And then I realized there's a lot I don't know about publishing, despite the fact that I have published multiple books. So I wanted to go out there and get industry experts. So I interviewed book editors, authors, I interviewed agents, and separately I interviewed Cece Lira, who then became my agent, and I interviewed Carly Waters, and those segments were so popular. And I had an idea, why don't I do one episode in which they look at query letters and opening pages? Because that's the hardest thing for authors to do, right? And we did one segment and it was just so popular. I said to them, is there any chance you would join me as co-hosts? And they immediately generously gave up their time, said absolutely. And we dedicate a lot of time to this podcast. I spend about 3 to 4 days a week on the podcast, whether it's reading books, preparing for interviews, looking at critiques, doing the admin, etc. They spend an awful lot of time on it as well. We don't earn an income from the podcast at all advertising. All of our subscriber support goes into producing the podcast, but we are now, Estelle, starting to get letters from people whose submissions we critiqued 2 years ago, who now have agents and who've now sold their books and who are now entering publishing and living their dreams. And that's why we do it. We want to get more people understanding how publishing works and getting more books published.
I love that. It's just a gift to the writing community, to people who want to get published and learn, how the sauce is made, which is kind of why I do this podcast, distilling my 3 decades of experience in publishing. So
and that is why I cannot wait to have you on our podcast to talk about writing that gets noticed, because when you are able to take those 3 decades of experience and you're able to put that in a book and you're able to, give practical examples and share theory in a way that's accessible to people who desperately need that information, that's incredible. Because I know when I was trying to get published, these kinds of books were essential to me because I wasn't able to do an MFA. I couldn't afford that. So these books like yours were my MFA. And so they are so invaluable to emerging authors.
Well, that's so great to hear. And thank you so much for saying that I'm so excited to do your podcast as well. So you interview so many writers on your podcast. And I love that in one interview you had with the best-selling, award-winning author Ann Patchett about her novel, Tom Lake, you dove deep into how she chose, her POVs and how she kind of had to learn first person POV all over again, even though she thought it was the easy way. And, breaking the writing rule of starting with a character desperately wanting something. And you really elicited these great discussions from her. And it's just one of the many wonderful episodes for my listeners and viewers to go ahead and check out. And so the way that you got Anne to open up, can you share some of your interviewing techniques that really work for you to get the information that you need for your audience?
Yeah, I think one, all credit goes to Anne. She is just an exceptional guest. I think it's impossible to have a bad interview with Ann Patchett, quite honestly. She's just so generous and insightful. But as well, our podcast is not like a book club podcast. We're not talking about just themes and things that a book club podcast might talk about. As you say, it's about how the sausage is made. So we teach people, these are the rules, follow these rules. And like with Picasso, he had to learn how to paint in a very traditional way before he could unlearn that and do what he did. And that's what a master like Ann Patchett is doing. She's taking these traditional ways that have been mastered, and she's just like, nope, I am going to do something completely different, and I'm going to make it look easy. But you and I will read that book in a very different way that just a regular reader might read it, because you and I are trying to see how the rabbit gets pulled out of the hat. And so when she pulls the rabbit out of the hat, as a writer, I'm like, oh my word, how the heck did she do that? And I go back in and I really dig apart and I go, look at what she did here. How did she do this? And so I think people like Anne enjoy those kinds of conversations because they don't get to discuss that level of detail so often. And the important thing is really to listen. You know, you're an excellent interviewer, so you know this, that yes, it's important to prepare for an interview. Have all of your questions, do your homework, have everything there, but listen to what that person is saying, because my best interviews have been where I have thrown away my whole list of questions because what the person is saying is way more fascinating than what's on my page. And I actually interviewed Anne for an event once before for HarperCollins. And I had my whole list of questions and I said, Anne, here's my list of questions. And she said, my advice to you when you're interviewing is you don't even have a list of questions. She said when she interviews big name authors and people like Tom Hanks, she throws out the questions and she just has a conversation. Now, I will never be that confident, but it was excellent advice.
It's kind of like a chat. You're going with the flow. You're not like, and now tell me when you wrote that, when you were, and then you're answering in some other direction. And then you're going back to nervously going back to the question.
I've seen like a bad interview where Kate Atkinson, who wrote Life After Life, she is an incredible writer. And I saw her being interviewed by someone who started off the interview by talking about a book and said, let's talk about this as a war novel. And the first thing Kate Atkinson said was, I do not view it as a war novel. I view it as a behind the scenes novel, etc. And she explained why. And the interviewer went, oh, thank you. And then the very next question was to focus again on how this book was a war novel, because that's what she'd prepared. And she wasn't listening to Kate Atkins saying, this is not at all how I view my novel. And at that point, she should have thrown her notes out and gone, okay, let's reposition everything we thought we knew about this book and really listen to what the author was saying.
I agree. And I think even though I've been in publishing on both sides of the publishing wall as an editor-in-chief, an author, a writer, and a teacher, I feel like there's always something new for me to learn. For example, I learned from your interview with Anne that she felt, even though she said she used it a lot in her book, that flashbacks are not a very good or effective device. And I thought, oh my gosh, because I've read several books in the past 6 months and they used flashbacks excessively. And I thought, well, maybe I should use flashbacks in the novel in progress I'm working on. And now I hear that and I'm thinking, I'm going to look at things a little bit differently. And that's what I love about kind of these master classes that are available to everyone from your podcast, from Freelance Writing Direct. People are learning from you today. And so it's such a great process to be a part of. So what actionable writing tips can you share for writing fiction and or fantasy for the reader?
You know what, my biggest thing is that there is no magic formula to writing a book. Each person is going to come at it differently. You are your own greatest asset. If you are someone who is really organized and you are able to outline in detail and you know exactly where everything's going to go, lean into that because it's going to make your life easier. If you're not someone who can plot, if you're someone who likes figuring things out as you go along, which is what I like to do, don't try and change. That's our greatest strength, Estelle. Like, we write to find out what's going to happen. And if we're surprised, our readers are surprised, right?
Yes, I love that. I thought there was something wrong. I'm like, I'm a plotter. In an article, yes, but in writing a novel, definitely not.
Same. If I
Wow.
know what's going to happen, I have zero interest in writing it. And yet I spent so many years putting pressure on myself to outline and to plot because that's what other authors did. And that's just nonsense. Each of us are individuals. We have our strengths, we have weaknesses, certainly, but lean into your strengths. If you're a very visual person, make vision boards, surround yourself with this world, do what works for you, not what works for other people, and then be passionate about what you're writing about, because writing a novel can take a long time. For some people it can take 10 years. It's bum in chair every day, maybe when you don't feel like it, and the only thing that's going to keep you coming back to it, if it's something that you care about, if you have something to say and you feel passionately about it. So I say to my students, write about the things that are going to make you wave a turkey leg around at your family at Thanksgiving, because you feel so strongly about it, the thing that makes you start these arguments with family members. Because if you feel passionate about your subject matter, if you've got something to say, that will help motivate you through the many, many times when you're going to want to feel like you want to give up. And finally, trust in the process, trust your voice, trust that you have something to say. Do not allow the critic into the drafting room. The critic is allowed to sit with you when you're at the editing stage. Do not allow the critic to give you imposter syndrome while you're writing and telling you you're not good enough, no one's going to care, or to be editing your work as you're writing it. And those are just the most practical tips that I can ever give.
I feel like a witchiness coming through it because it's the core of strength and believing in yourself and knowing that you have something to offer and you don't have to be in cookie cutter mode. So I love that, Bianca. Thank you. So I wanted to ask you one more question and then segue to the questions for my subscribers on Substack. Are there any authors that you haven't yet had on the podcast who you would love to have?
Oh my goodness, there are so many, so many. I'm busy at the moment trying to get a whole bunch of authors on. TJ Klune, who writes in the fantasy genre. I've been trying very hard to get TJ Klune on. There are people who are like, oh, why don't you just have, Salman Rushdie on the podcast? Or why don't you just have Sally Rooney on the podcast, etc. So there are some big name authors who don't do a lot of podcasts. You'll know their books sell like hotcakes. They don't need to do promotional things. So it's really difficult to get them on. But there's other authors who I read who perhaps don't have a big audience, whose books didn't sell like hotcakes, but who were incredible, incredible writers. And the book may have been quiet and maybe it didn't make a big splash, but I want to interview those authors too. So honestly, my stack of people that I want to interview is very long. Anne Patchett was one of my bucket list authors that I got to interview, and that was incredible. But yeah, if I went through all of them that I wanted, we would be here all day. I'm greedy.
So what is next for you? And where can people find you? And you don't have to give all the social because I'm gonna put them on the show notes.
Yeah. No, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter. I am furiously working to deliver a novel by my deadline, which is the 15th of January. It is another fantasy novel, but this one is a closed room murder mystery. I am pitching it as Knives Out meets Succession, but with magical people. And Estelle, I have pantsed a closed room murder mystery. I think I'm the only person in the history of the universe that was like, I don't know who dies. I don't know why they die. I don't know who killed them, but let's dive in and see what happens. And so far it's worked out. I've trusted the process.
I can't wait to read that one. So thank you so much for being on the program. I have so enjoyed speaking with you. I can't wait to meet you and hang out with you and be on the panel with you talking all about podcasts that focus on writing and publishing. Thank you. Follow me at EstelleSErasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.